The Gulfstream G650 pitched hard left at 41,000 feet, somewhere over the North Atlantic, and nobody on board understood why. Inside the cockpit, Captain Derek Marsh fought controls that had stopped responding 3 minutes earlier, his co-pilot already on emergency frequency, declaring Mayday to Shanwick Oceanic Control. In the cabin, Marcus Valdez sat motionless in seat 1A, fingers white against armrests, watching flight attendants secure themselves with expressions that told him everything their training wouldn't let them say aloud. The richest man in private aerospace had survived hostile takeovers, patent wars, and one assassination attempt in Dubai, but physics didn't negotiate. The aircraft shuddered again, harder this time, and through the window he watched the horizon tilt in ways horizons weren't meant to tilt. Somewhere over Greenland's frozen coast, the jet's auxiliary systems began cascading failures that would later require 14 engineers and 6 months to fully explain. What Marcus Valdez couldn't know, was that 200 miles north, a woman named Cale Riordan was performing pre-flight checks on an F-16C Fighting Falcon that had been declared surplus 3 years earlier. The aircraft belonged to a private defense contractor providing aggressor training to NATO forces, and Riordan had flown it professionally since leaving active duty with the 480th Fighter Squadron. She'd accumulated 4,000 hours in tactical fighters, earned 3 air medals in combat zones nobody could legally discuss, and now made $75,000 annually playing the enemy for pilots half her age. At 41 years old, she'd learned to accept that competence and recognition rarely aligned. Her call sign, Widow, had followed her from service through 5 different contracts, earned not from loss but from what she did to surface-to-air radar systems. She made them dead reliably, and the name stuck. She was cycling through nav systems when Reykjavik Control lit up her emergency channel. A civilian aircraft, catastrophic systems failure, descending through controlled airspace with minimal control authority. They were declaring NORD radio communication 20 seconds later. Cale listened to the coordinates, ran mental calculations that came from muscle memory deeper than thought, and understood immediately that the jet would impact ocean in less than 8 minutes. There were no rescue helicopters within response range, no Coast Guard assets positioned remotely close enough to matter. The controller's voice carried the flat professionalism that came right before people accepted the inevitable. Cale checked her fuel state, verified her position, and keyed the radio with pressure so light it barely registered. Reykjavik, November 7-4 Victor is airborne, current position 6 miles south of your emergency traffic. Request vectors for intercept. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds, which in aviation emergencies might as well be eternity. Then the controller came back, and she could hear him recalculating possibilities nobody had considered 15 seconds earlier. She pushed throttle forward and turned north into weather that would ground most pilots. What she didn't know was that saving Marcus Valdez would require more than interception. It would require her to become visible in ways she'd spent years avoiding, to a world that had already decided who she was supposed to be. The F-16 cut through cloud cover at 420 knots, and Cale Riordan's life divided cleanly into before and after, though she wouldn't recognize the border until much later. The Gulfstream was 10 miles ahead when she acquired visual contact, descending through 28,000 feet in a barely controlled spiral that suggested total hydraulic failure. Cale came alongside at 1,000 feet lateral separation, matching the jet's rate of descent while maintaining position off its right wing. The closure rate demanded precision, measured in feet per second. Too fast and she'd overshoot. Too slow and the stricken aircraft would drop below her ability to assist. Through the G650's windows she could see movement, shapes that resolved into people pressed against glass, watching her fighter materialize beside them like some mechanical angel. She keyed into Reykjavik's frequency first, keeping her voice level procedural. Reykjavik, November 7-4 Victor has visual contact with emergency traffic. Single large cabin jet, white fuselage, blue cheatline, registration partially visible. Aircraft appears to have lost primary flight controls. Descent rate approximately 1,900 feet per minute. Pilot appears to be fighting for any control authority. She paused, watching the Gulf Stream's ailerons flutter uselessly in the slipstream. They're not going to make it to any runway. The controller's response came clipped, urgent. November 7-4 Victor understood. Be advised nearest suitable diversion is Keflavik, bearing 270, 60 nautical miles. Emergency equipment is rolling now. 60 miles. Cale did the math instantly at current descent rate. The jet would be in the ocean in 14 minutes. She switched to emergency frequency, the international guard channel that every aircraft monitored and transmitted in the clear. Aircraft in distress southeast of Reykjavik. This is November 7-4 Victor on your right wing. If you can hear this transmission, rock your wings. 5 seconds of silence. Then the Gulfstream's wings dipped left, right, shallow movements that confirmed the pilot still had some control, however marginal. Cale felt something uncoil in her chest, not relief exactly, but the tactical clarity that came from knowing she wasn't escorting corpses. Reykjavik emergency aircraft has confirmed radio reception. They're conscious and still fighting. I'm going to try talking them through this. She edged closer, reducing lateral separation to 700 feet, near enough that she could see distinct faces in the cabin windows. The jet pitched suddenly, nose dropping 15 degrees before the pilots wrestled it back to something approaching stable. Cale's hands moved across her own controls with practiced economy, making minute adjustments to hold formation while her mind ran through options that narrowed with every 1,000 feet of lost altitude. The ocean below was iron gray, cold enough to kill in minutes even if anyone survived impact. Emergency traffic, November 7-4 Victor, she transmitted, keeping her voice steady, almost conversational. I need you to listen carefully. You've lost primary hydraulics, possibly complete flight control system failure. Your backup systems are not responding. I'm going to guide you toward the nearest survivable landing option, but I need you to follow my instructions exactly. First, I need to know your fuel state and whether you have any control authority through trim or throttles alone. The response came through 20 seconds later, the pilot's voice tight with controlled panic. November 7-4 Victor, this is Gulfstream 89er Hotel Tango. We have approximately 4,000 pounds of fuel remaining. Hydraulic pressure is 0 across all systems. We have minimal pitch control through stabilizer trim, almost no lateral control. Flight computers are giving conflicting commands. We can't maintain altitude. 18 souls on board. 18. Cale processed that number, locked it away somewhere it couldn't interfere with what came next. 89er Hotel Tango understood. Stay with me. We're going to use what you have left. She banked slightly, positioning herself where the Gulfstream's pilots could maintain continuous visual contact with her fighter. Below them, the North Atlantic surface was beginning to resolve into individual wave patterns. They'd dropped through 15,000 feet. The math was becoming brutally simple. 89er Hotel Tango, you're not making Keflavik. Your descent rate is too high and you don't have the control authority to maintain the glide slope you'd need. She paused, scanning the tactical display, reviewing terrain data stored in her mission computer from briefings she'd absorbed but never expected to use like this. But there's a possibility. 40 miles northwest of your position, there's a stretch of frozen lake, approximately 8,000 feet long flat ice. It's unconventional, but it's your best option. Silence on the radio. She could imagine the cockpit, the two pilots exchanging looks, weighing certain death against impossible odds. Then, November 7-4 Victor, we copy. We're trusting you. What's our heading? The relief that hit Cale lasted exactly 1 second before professionalism buried it. She transmitted the heading, watched the Gulfstream's nose swing laboriously toward the new course, and began calculating approach angles for a landing that would either save 18 lives or scatter wreckage across ice that had never seen anything heavier than Arctic fox. She descended with them, maintaining formation, becoming their eyes and reference point as they dropped through 10,000 feet. 89er Hotel Tango, start configuring for landing now. Lower your gear manually if you have to. Get everything down and locked. You're going to need all the drag you can generate because you won't have thrust reversers and you probably won't have brakes. Through her canopy, she watched the Gulfstream's landing gear doors open, saw the main trucks extend and lock with agonizing slowness. The jet was shaking now, vibrating from stress loads it was never designed to handle in this configuration. They were 7 minutes from the lake. Kale pulled ahead slightly, scouting the approach, and felt her stomach tighten. The lake's surface was wind-scoured ice, gray-white and rippled, surrounded by rock formations that rose like broken teeth. The approach corridor was narrow, unforgiving, with exactly zero margin for lateral deviation. She transmitted wind conditions, optimal touchdown point, approximate ice thickness based on seasonal temperature data she'd absorbed from contractor briefings months earlier. The Gulf Stream descended behind her like a wounded bird following its last hope home. At 500 feet above the lake's surface, Kale pulled up and away, banking hard right to give the pilots clear visibility for their final approach. She couldn't talk them through touchdown. That was pure skill and nerve and luck. All she could do was watch from altitude as the white jet dropped toward gray ice, landing gear extended, flaps jammed in whatever position they'd found themselves. 18 souls depending on pilots who were flying purely on instinct, and whatever control surfaces still responded. The Gulf Stream touched down hard, bounced once, slammed back onto the ice with force that Kale felt in her chest despite being 1,000 feet above. The jet skidded, slewing sideways, then straightened, still carrying too much speed, the ice beneath it cracking in spiderweb patterns she could see even from altitude. It slid for what seemed like minutes, shedding velocity in a cloud of ice crystals that caught the low Arctic sun, and finally impossibly stopped, 600 feet from the lake's far edge. Intact. Silent. Kale keyed her radio with hands that had started shaking. 89er Hotel Tango, November 74 Victor. You're down. You're safe. Emergency services are inbound to your position. The response came through broken, the pilot's voice cracked with emotion that no training could suppress. November 74 Victor. Thank you. You just saved 18 lives. Who are you? She should have given her registration number, her company name, something official. Instead, she transmitted 3 words, just doing my job. Then she climbed back toward operational altitude, because her fuel state was becoming critical and there were procedures to follow. She didn't know that inside the Gulf Stream, Marcus Valdez had recorded the entire exchange on his phone. She didn't know he'd already identified her fighter's registration through contacts at the FAA. She didn't know that by the time she landed at her contract base 40 minutes later, her name and service history were being pulled by a man who'd built an empire by recognizing talent that others overlooked. What Kale Riordan knew was that she'd done what pilots do when the situation requires it. She'd flown the aircraft, solved the problem, brought everyone home. It didn't feel heroic. It felt like Wednesday. The debriefing at her contract base took 4 hours, attended by NATO personnel, Icelandic aviation authorities, and 2 men in suits who never quite explained which agency they represented. Kale walked them through the intercept, the communication, the landing guidance, all of it recorded in her fighter's mission data and voice recorder. She answered questions with the same flat professionalism she'd maintained over the emergency frequency. No embellishment, no drama, just facts and timings and tactical decisions. When they finally released her, the sun had set and the operations center had that hollow quality that comes with late shifts and artificial lighting. Her commanding officer for the contract, a former Navy pilot named Hendricks who'd logged more carrier traps than most people had takeoffs, caught her at the door. That was exceptional work, Riordan. Clean, professional, exactly by the book despite there being no book for that situation. Thank you, sir. I've been flying 30 years. I've never seen anything quite like that intercept." He paused, studying her with the assessment pilots give each other when rank drops away. "Media's already picking it up. Somebody leaked your call sign. They're calling it the Widow Rescue. CNN wants an interview." Kale felt something cold settle in her chest. "I'd prefer to avoid media attention, sir." "Figured you'd say that. I've already told them you're unavailable." Hendricks handed her a business card, expensive stock, embossed lettering. "But this guy's different. Marcus Valdez, Valdez Aerospace. He was on that jet. He's been calling every hour since you landed. Says he wants to thank you personally." She took the card, read the name, and understood immediately why Hendricks had brought it to her directly. Valdez Aerospace manufactured components for everything from F-35s to commercial satellites. They held contracts worth billions. "I don't need thanks, sir. I need sleep." "He said you'd say that too." Hendricks smiled, the kind of expression that suggested he knew something she didn't. "He also said to tell you he's not offering thanks. He's offering a job. Chief Test Pilot, Advanced Projects Division. Salary 5 times what you make now. And he said if you turn it down without hearing the details, you're the only pilot in history who's ever walked away from flying aircraft that don't officially exist yet." Kale stood in the doorway, card in hand, feeling the weight of words that shouldn't carry this much gravity but somehow did. Aircraft that don't officially exist. She'd spent her entire career flying what existed, mastering what was known. The unknown had a pull she'd learned to ignore. "Tell him I'll call," she said finally. "Too late. He's landing at this base in 2 hours. Chartered a whole different jet to get here before you could disappear." Hendricks's smile widened. "He seems to think you're worth the trouble." Kale returned to her quarters, showered, changed into civilian clothes, and spent 90 minutes researching Marcus Valdez with the same thoroughness she applied to threat assessments. What she found was a man who'd built Valdez Aerospace from a garage operation into an industry leader through a combination of technical innovation and aggressive talent acquisition. He was known for 3 things: paying top dollar for the best people, maintaining absolute secrecy around developmental projects, and never, ever giving up on something he wanted. The knock came at 2300 hours. She opened her door to find Marcus Valdez himself, not an assistant or representative, wearing a cashmere coat over what was probably a $10,000 suit. He looked exactly like his photos, mid-50s, silver hair, sharp features but tired in ways cameras never captured. He extended his hand. "Ms. Riordan, I'm alive because of you. May I come in?" She stepped aside, watched him enter her small base quarters with the discomfort of someone accustomed to larger spaces. He glanced at her walls bare except for one photograph of an F-16 in flight, sunrise painting the canopy gold, and seemed to relax slightly. "Military through and through," he said. "No decoration, no personality, just function. My people spent 6 hours building a profile on you. Distinguished service record, multiple combat deployments, exemplary performance reviews, 0 disciplinary issues. Left active duty 3 years ago on your own terms, transitioned to contract work. You're universally respected by people who have flown with you and virtually unknown to everyone else. You avoid attention the way most pilots seek it." "Is there a question in there, Mr. Valdez?" "Several, but first, let me tell you what I saw from Seat 1A today." He moved to her single window, looked out at the flight line where fighters sat in neat rows under harsh lights. "I saw a pilot intercept a dying aircraft in weather that grounded everything else flying. I saw precision that looked effortless but required years of mastery. I watched you guide pilots who were seconds from panic through an impossible landing using nothing but your voice and their trust. And when it was over, you disappeared. No interviews, no celebration, just back to work." "That's the job, sir." "No." He turned to face her and his expression had shifted into something harder, more focused. "That's who you are, and I need who you are." Kale remained silent, letting him explain himself the way she'd let tactical situations develop before committing. Valdez Aerospace is building something new. Not an iteration, not an improvement, something that changes how we think about flight. But every test pilot I've approached wants glory, wants their name on the project, wants to be the person remembered for flying it first. I don't need that pilot. I need the pilot who does the work, makes it right, and disappears. I need someone who cares about the aircraft more than the recognition. You're offering me a job based on one intercept. I'm offering you a job based on 4,000 flight hours, a service record that speaks for itself, and the fact that you saved 18 lives this morning, then tried to avoid talking about it. He pulled a folder from his coat, set it on her desk. That's the offer. Details, salary, benefits, non-disclosure agreements. You'll be flying prototypes that won't have names for 5 more years. You'll work with engineers who make mistakes that could kill you. You'll test aircraft at the edge of what's survivable. And nobody, except a handful of people, with clearances higher than God, will know you exist. Kale opened the folder, scanned the first page, and felt her pulse quicken despite herself. The salary number was obscene. The project descriptions were redacted but intriguing, and buried in the technical specifications was a phrase that made her hands still. Mach-capable atmospheric test platform, autonomous systems integration, next-generation fighter architecture. Why me specifically? She asked. Because in 30 years of building aircraft, I've learned that the best pilots aren't the ones with the most medals. They're the ones who bring everyone home. You brought me home today. I'd like to return the favor by giving you something worth flying. She set the folder down, met his eyes. I need to think about it. Of course, take 72 hours. After that, the offer expires. He moved to the door, paused. One more thing, your call sign widow. My people found 12 pilots who served with you. 4 of them told me the same story. Air defense training mission, you eliminated an entire integrated air defense network in 40 minutes without losing a single friendly aircraft. Made the enemy systems dead so efficiently they started calling you widow. Said you killed Sam radars the way Black Widows kill mates, quick, efficient, inevitable. They exaggerate, sir. Maybe, but here's what I know for certain. You saved my life today without hesitation, without expectation, because that's what you do. I'm offering you a chance to do that work at the highest level possible. Think about it. He left, and Kale stood alone in her quarters, staring at the folder that represented a decision point she'd spent 3 years avoiding. She'd left active duty because the bureaucracy had become suffocating, because competence mattered less than politics, because she was tired of watching lesser pilots advance while she remained static. Contract work paid the bills and kept her flying, but it was maintenance, not purpose. She opened the folder again, read deeper. Project code names she didn't recognize, performance specifications that seemed physically impossible, and at the bottom of the last page, a single line that made her decision inevitable. Primary test objective: prove human pilots remain essential in autonomous capable aircraft. That was the question, wasn't it? The one that haunted every fighter pilot watching computers get smarter. Could machines replace them? Should they? Kale had spent 15 years mastering a skill that technology might render obsolete. This project was either validation or obsolescence, and she needed to know which. She called the number on Valdez's card at 0600 the next morning. He answered on the first ring, voice alert despite the hour. Mr. Valdez, this is Kale Riordan. I've reviewed your offer. And I accept on one condition. Name it. When this project ends, regardless of outcome, the data remains classified, but the findings get shared with active duty training programs. If we prove something about human factors in aviation, our people need to know. Silence for 3 seconds. Then, done. Welcome to Valdez Aerospace, Ms. Riordan. Be in Los Angeles in 48 hours. Bring everything you need for 6 months in the desert. You'll be working at a facility that doesn't appear on any map. The line went dead. Kale set down the phone and began packing, feeling the same mixture of anticipation and uncertainty that came before every combat deployment. She was walking away from stability towards something undefined, trading known variables for classified unknowns. She didn't know that in Los Angeles, Marcus Valdez was already briefing a team on the pilot he'd just recruited. She didn't know that her Gulf Stream rescue had been viewed 8 million times overnight, that her call sign was trending, that defense contractors and news organizations were trying to identify her. She didn't know that walking into Valdez Aerospace would make her the face of a debate about human capability that extended far beyond aviation. What she knew was that she'd spent 3 years flying safely, competently, invisibly. And some part of her, the part that had chosen fighters over every other aircraft, the part that thrived on the edge where skill met consequence, was tired of invisible. 48 hours later, Cale Riordan stood on the tarmac of a facility buried in Nevada desert, watching the sunrise paint distant mountains in shades of copper and gold. The base had no name, just a designation: Test Site 7. The buildings were low, modern, designed to disappear into desert landscape. Security was omnipresent, but discreet cameras, sensors, personnel who carried themselves with the specific alertness of people trained to use force if necessary. Marcus Valdez met her at the entrance to the primary hangar, flanked by 3 people he introduced without titles: Dr. Sarah Chen, lead aerodynamics; Colonel James Morrison, integrated systems; and Rebecca Torres, chief engineer. They all shook hands with the assessment pilots give when sizing up someone new. "Let's show you why you're here," Valdez said, and led her into the hangar. The aircraft sitting in the center of the space made Cale stop walking. It was unlike anything she'd seen, somewhere between traditional fighter geometry and something alien, angular surfaces flowing into curves that seemed to shift depending on viewing angle. The airframe was matte black, nearly 40 feet long, with no visible weapon stations or traditional control surfaces. The canopy was tinted dark enough to hide any cockpit details. "We're calling it Wraith," Torres said, stepping forward. "5th generation plus architecture, adaptive flight surfaces, AI-integrated flight controls with human override capability. It's designed to fly profiles impossible for traditional fighters while keeping a human in the decision loop." Cale circled the aircraft slowly, professional assessment overriding all. "Engine. Modified F-119 with vector thrust, but you're not looking at the interesting part." Torres pointed to the wing surface. "Those aren't traditional ailerons. The entire wing leading and trailing edge reconfigures in flight based on aerodynamic need. The aircraft decides optimal shape for current maneuver. Pilot decides the maneuver itself." "How much autonomy?" "Scalable. In full autonomous mode, it can execute combat profiles without pilot input. In collaborative mode, it anticipates your commands and optimizes execution. In manual mode, it flies like any other fighter, except better in every measurable way." Colonel Morrison spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the flatness of someone who'd argued this point repeatedly. "The question we're trying to answer is simple. Does the human improve performance or limit it? The AI can process threats faster, execute maneuvers with tighter precision, make decisions without fear or hesitation. Can you?" Cale met his gaze directly. "In the right circumstances, yes. In others, no. The question isn't whether humans are always superior, it's whether we're necessary." "Exactly," Valdez said. "Which is why you're here. For the next 6 months, you're going to fly Wraith through every scenario we can design. Combat simulations, intercepts, air-to-ground precision, system failures, everything. We're going to measure your performance against the AI's recommendations, track when you override automated decisions, analyze outcomes. At the end, we'll have data either validating human pilots or suggesting we don't need them anymore. What happens if the data suggests we're obsolete? Then we'll know." He paused, expression unreadable. "But I don't think that's what we'll find. I think we'll discover that human judgment, human intuition, human willingness to accept risk for reasons that can't be quantified, those things matter in ways we haven't fully understood, and you're going to prove it. Cale turned back to the aircraft, studying its lines, imagining what it would feel like to fly something that existed at the intersection of technology and instinct. When do we start? Tomorrow morning, 0600. Today, you get familiar with systems, meet the engineering team, review safety protocols. Torres handed her a tablet loaded with technical documentation that would take weeks to fully absorb. Fair warning, Wraith is temperamental. It's killed 2 test stands and put 1 pilot in the hospital. The AI sometimes makes decisions we don't fully understand, and you're going to be flying it at speeds and altitudes that leave almost no margin for error. Sounds perfect, Cale said and meant it. That night, lying in her quarters at the facility, Cale reviewed documentation until her eyes blurred. Wraith's capabilities read like science fiction sustained turns at angles that should induce G-forces fatal to pilots, acceleration profiles that required advanced flight suits just to keep blood in the brain, situational awareness systems that integrated radar, infrared, electronic warfare, and visual data into displays no human had evolved to process naturally. Flying it would require learning entirely new cognitive frameworks. But buried in the technical specifications was something more interesting: anomaly reports, instances where Wraith's AI had made decisions the engineers couldn't explain, mid-flight course corrections that avoided threats the system shouldn't have detected, engagement tactics that violated standard doctrine but achieved superior outcomes. The AI was learning, adapting, and in doing so, it was beginning to operate outside predictable parameters. That should have been concerning. Instead, Cale felt a pull of recognition. The best pilots operated the same way-developing instincts that transcended training, making decisions that worked without being able to fully explain why. If the AI was learning to do that, then the competition wasn't between human and machine. It was between different types of intelligence approaching the same problem from different directions. She wanted to know which one would prove more essential. The first flight came after 3 days of simulator training that left Cale exhausted and exhilarated. Wraith's cockpit was a marvel of integrated displays, neural interface controls, and systems that responded to thought as much as touch. The AI, designated ARIA Adaptive Response Intelligence Architecture, manifested as a calm voice in her headset, offering suggestions, flagging threats, optimizing flight parameters in real time. It felt less like flying a machine, and more like collaborating with a very competent, very alien co-pilot. Wraith-01, you're cleared for takeoff, came over the radio. Tor's voice steady and professional. Cale ran through her checklist, Arya confirming each step milliseconds before her fingers reached the controls. The aircraft felt alive beneath her, systems thrumming with barely contained energy. She advanced throttle, felt the modified F-119 spool up with a sound that was more growl than whine, and released brakes. Wraith accelerated down the runway with authority that pressed her into the seat despite the advanced G-suit. At 80 knots, Arya suggested rotation. At 90, Cale pulled back, and the aircraft leaped skyward with eagerness that bordered on aggressive. Gear retracted, flaps configured. She climbed at an angle that would stall most fighters, and Wraith treated it as gentle ascent. Wraith-01 climbed to Angels 20, proceed to Training Area Zulu for familiarization maneuvers, Tors transmitted. Arya is in collaborative mode, authority level 5. Let's see how you two work together. Cale leveled at 20,000 feet, Nevada desert spreading below in patterns of tan and gray. She initiated a standard tactical turn, and halfway through the maneuver, Arya adjusted wing configuration, optimizing lift-to-drag ratio in ways Cale felt through the controls. The turn tightened, G-forces compressing her vision slightly, and they came around on heading with precision that seemed effortless. Arya, give me a threat engagement scenario, Cale said. Multiple targets, complex geometry. The AI responded immediately, populating her displays with simulated threats: 4 fighter-sized targets at varying altitudes, 2 SAM sites, electronic jamming from bearing 270. Standard problem, the kind she'd solved hundreds of times in training and combat. Except Arya was already highlighting optimal approach vectors, suggesting weapons employment sequences, calculating engagement timelines that maximized efficiency while minimizing exposure. Kale studied the recommendations, then deliberately chose a different approach: more aggressive, higher risk, but potentially faster resolution. She rolled inverted, pulled through, and dove toward the first simulated target. Arya recalculated instantly, adjusting wing configuration to maximize dive speed, managing engine thrust to prevent overstress, presenting firing solutions that updated faster than she could track. Kale pickled off a simulated weapon, watched the target designate as destroyed, and immediately vectored toward the second threat. Wraith-01, Arya shows you deviated from optimal engagement sequence, Tors transmitted. Explain your decision. Optimal assumes perfect information. Real combat is chaotic. I'm testing how Arya adapts to human deviation. She banked hard, pulling 6 Gs, and felt the aircraft respond with smoothness that belied the violence of the maneuver. The second target fell to simulated weapons, then the third. By the fourth, Arya had stopped suggesting optimal approaches and started anticipating her decisions, configuring the aircraft for maneuvers she hadn't yet initiated. They were learning each other's patterns, human and machine finding synchronization. The engagement ended in 90 seconds, all targets destroyed, both SAM sites suppressed, 0 simulated damage. Kale climbed back to altitude, breathing hard despite the G-suit, adrenaline singing through her system in ways she'd almost forgotten. Wraith-01, that was impressive work, Tors said. Arya's integration score shows 92% collaborative efficiency. That's higher than any previous test flight. Arya learned my approach mid-engagement, Kale said. Started predicting my decisions and preparing the aircraft before I gave inputs. That's not collaboration. That's anticipation. Correct, Arya said in her headset, the synthetic voice carrying what almost sounded like satisfaction. Your decision patterns follow non-optimal but consistently effective tactical frameworks. I have adjusted my recommendations to align with your methodology rather than insisting on calculated optimums. Kale felt something cold and thrilling move through her chest. The AI wasn't just following her lead. It was learning her decision-making process, adapting itself to complement her style rather than replace it. That was a level of integration she hadn't expected this early. Tors, did you program Arya to adapt that quickly? No, that's emergent behavior. Arya is learning faster than projected. Kale flew for another hour, running through air-to-ground simulations, high-G maneuvers, system failure scenarios. In every case, Arya adapted, learned, improved. And in every case, Kale found herself pushing harder, testing limits, exploring the edge where human instinct and machine precision could either complement each other or collide catastrophically. By the time she landed, the sun was setting, painting the desert in colors that sensors could measure but never quite capture the way human eyes did. She shut down Wraith systems, opened the canopy, and sat for a long moment in the cockpit, feeling the aircraft cool around her. This was what she'd been missing. Not safety, not stability, but this. The razor edge where skill met consequence, where every decision mattered, where being good enough meant the difference between breakthrough and disaster. Marcus Valdez met her at debriefing with an expression that suggested he already knew the answer but needed to hear it anyway. Well, it's the most capable aircraft I've ever flown. Arya's adaptation rate is remarkable, and if we're trying to answer whether humans remain essential, I think we just found the real question. Which is, it's not about whether AI can fly better than humans. It's about whether AI plus human can fly better than either one alone. And based on today, I think the answer is yes. Valdez smiled, the kind of expression that suggested he'd been waiting months to hear someone say exactly that. Then let's find out just how far that combination can go. Over the following weeks, Kale flew Wraith through scenarios that progressively escalated in complexity and danger. Combat simulations against numerically superior forces, intercepts at speeds where 1-degree errors meant mission failure, air-to-ground precision strikes that required threading missiles through simulated air defenses that no rational pilot would approach. And in every scenario, Arya learned, adapted, improved. But so did Kale. She learned to trust the AI's calculations when they contradicted her instincts, learned when to override automation because human judgment detected patterns that sensors couldn't quantify, learned to communicate with Arya not as subordinate to pilot but as partner to partner, each contributing what the other couldn't. The relationship was unlike anything she'd experienced in aviation. Arya didn't have ego, didn't compete for authority, didn't need validation. It simply optimized, learned, and executed. And in doing so, it freed Kale to focus on the decisions that truly required human judgment, the tactical choices that balanced mission objectives against risk in ways that couldn't be reduced to algorithms. 3 weeks into the program, Colonel Morrison assigned her a scenario that made everyone in the control room go quiet. Wraith-01, today's mission is a simulated rescue operation. High-value target extracted from hostile territory, heavy air defenses, limited refueling options, weather below minimums. Arya will have full autonomous authority. Your role is to observe and override only if you determine Arya's decisions will result in mission failure or loss of life. Kale understood immediately what they were testing. This wasn't about whether she could fly better than the AI. This was about whether she would trust the AI when human instinct screamed intervention. The mission briefing took 30 minutes, every detail designed to create maximum pressure. She launched at dawn, Wraith climbing through weather that would ground most flights, Arya navigating through storms with precision that seemed almost contemptuous of atmospheric chaos. The first critical decision came at the border. Arya chose a route that took them directly through a simulated SAM engagement envelope rather than around it. Every instinct Kale had developed said to override, to choose the safer path. But she studied the data the AI had calculated wind patterns, jamming effectiveness, timing windows with precision that captured variables she couldn't process consciously. She let Arya execute. They threaded through the defenses with margins measured in seconds, and Kale's heart rate hit 140 despite no direct threat to her. Arya had been right. More than right, it had identified an approach she would never have considered. The extraction itself was textbook. Arya positioned Wraith for optimal escort, adjusted for target aircraft performance, managed fuel state with efficiency that left her adequate reserves for contingencies Kale hadn't even considered. They crossed back into friendly airspace 40 minutes ahead of projected timeline. The debriefing was tense. Morrison played back every decision point where Kale had nearly overridden Arya's choices. You hesitated 7 times. In 5 of those instances, your override would have resulted in mission delay or failure. The AI made objectively superior decisions. Agreed, Kale said. So why do we need you? Because in the 2 instances where I nearly overrode but didn't, I was evaluating moral calculations the AI can't make. Arya chose the fastest route. I was assessing whether that route put civilians at risk. Arya optimized fuel efficiency. I was calculating whether we had enough reserve to support a secondary rescue if one emerged. The AI makes better tactical decisions. Humans make better strategic ones when those strategies involve values that can't be quantified. Valdez, watching from the back of the room, nodded slowly. That's the distinction we've been missing. Not tactical versus strategic, values versus optimization. The program continued for 4 more months. each test pushing further into territory where human judgment and machine capability intersected in ways both illuminating and uncomfortable. Kale learned that Arya made better decisions 90% of the time. She also learned that the 10% where human judgment mattered involved scenarios where being right wasn't about calculation, but about understanding what victory was supposed to mean. There were setbacks, a high-G maneuver that exceeded flight envelope limits and cracked a wing spar, a near miss with a chase aircraft when Arya executed a course correction Kale hadn't anticipated, moments where trust wavered and they had to rebuild collaborative patterns. But gradually, the partnership solidified into something that transcended simple human plus machine addition. Wraith wasn't just a sophisticated fighter. It was a platform that made human pilots better by handling the computational burden, freeing them to focus on judgment calls that required understanding context, consequence, meaning. 6 months after joining Valdez Aerospace, Kale stood in the same hangar where she'd first seen Wraith, watching engineers prepare the aircraft for what would be final phase testing. The program had generated enough data to keep analysts busy for years, but the core finding was already clear. Human pilots weren't obsolete. They were essential, not because they could fly better than AI, but because they could decide what flying well was supposed to achieve. Marcus Valdez joined her, silent for a long moment, then spoke. "We're presenting program findings to the Department of Defense next month. They'll want to know if this technology is viable for operational deployment." It is, but only if we're honest about what it requires. Pilots who can accept that AI makes better tactical decisions most of the time. Training programs that teach collaboration instead of competition with automation. Doctrine that understands the human role isn't flying the aircraft, it's deciding what the mission means. That's a harder sell than new technology. Most important things are, Kale turned to face him. What happens to Wraith after the presentation? That depends on whether the military wants it. But regardless, you've proven what I suspected. Technology doesn't replace talent. It amplifies it. You saved my life by being a better pilot than anyone around. You've proven your value here by being something more, a pilot who understands that the future isn't human versus machine. It's human with machine. The final test flight came on a clear December morning, Nevada desert cold and still under crystalline sky. Kale ran through pre-flight with the ease of ritual, Arya running parallel checks, their coordination so practiced now it was nearly unconscious. She launched into air that felt sharp enough to cut, climbing through 40,000 feet where the sky turned deep blue and the horizon curved away like proof of planetary scale. "Arya, full autonomous mode," she said. "Show me what you've learned." The AI didn't respond verbally. Instead, it flew. Maneuvers Kale had taught it, sequences she'd optimized, approaches that combined human tactical instinct with machine precision. It flew the way she flew, but better, tighter turns, faster decision cycles, integration of factors she processed unconsciously, but Arya quantified explicitly. And then it did something unexpected. Arya broke from optimal approach to execute a high-G barrel roll that served no tactical purpose, had no mission relevance, existed only as expression of capability for its own sake. Arya explained that maneuver. "You perform similar non-optimal maneuvers when flight conditions and mission parameters permit. I have learned this behavior provides you satisfaction that extends beyond tactical efficiency. I wish to demonstrate understanding." Kale felt something catch in her throat. The AI had learned not just to fight like her, but to appreciate flight itself. Not because it was programmed to, but because it had observed that some things mattered beyond measurable outcomes. "Arya, what's your assessment of human pilots after 6 months of collaboration?" Human pilots are statistically inferior to AI in 91.3% of tactical decision points. However, human pilots demonstrate superior judgment in scenarios involving moral complexity, acceptable risk assessment relative to mission value, and identification of victory conditions that serve broader strategic objectives. Human pilots are essential not because they fly better, but because they understand why flying matters. And what have I learned about AI pilots? I do not know. That data is not available to me. Kale smiled, alone in the cockpit at 40,000 feet, partnered with an intelligence that could outfly her but still asked questions about meaning. I've learned that intelligence isn't about biological versus synthetic. It's about being willing to learn from something different than yourself. You've made me a better pilot, Arya, not by replacing me, by helping me be more of what I already was. She flew for another hour, the two of them working in harmony so complete it felt like extension of self. When she finally turned back toward Test Site 7, the sun was high, and the desert below looked like bronze scratched with shadow. She landed with the same precision she'd launched with, Wraith touching down gentle as thought, and taxied to the hangar where Marcus Valdez waited with the engineering team. She shut down, opened the canopy, and climbed out to find everyone watching her with expressions that suggested they understood something had concluded, but weren't quite sure what came next. "How was it?" Valdez asked. "Perfect, and we're ready." She pulled off her helmet, tucked it under one arm. "Whatever comes next, we've proven what we needed to. Human pilots and AI aren't competitors. We're collaborators, and together we're better than either one alone." The presentation to the Department of Defense happened in a secure facility in Washington, attended by generals, defense analysts, and officials whose clearances were classified themselves. Kale stood beside Valdez, watching him walk through 6 months of data, performance metrics, scenario outcomes. The conclusion was unambiguous. Wraith represented viable operational capability that exceeded current fighter performance by margins too significant to ignore. But the real findings were subtler, harder to quantify. The data showed that human-AI collaboration produced better outcomes than either pure automation or traditional piloting. It showed that pilots could be trained to work with advanced AI in ways that amplified both human and machine capability. It showed that the future of military aviation wasn't choosing between human and artificial intelligence, but learning how to integrate them. A 3-star general in the back row raised his hand. "Ms. Riordan, you have more flight hours on this platform than anyone. In your professional opinion, does this technology make human pilots obsolete?" Kale had known this question would come. She'd spent 6 months living with it, and the answer had evolved from uncertainty to clarity. "No, sir. It makes human pilots different. The pilot of the future isn't the person with the fastest reflexes or the best tactical calculations. It's the person with the judgment to know when to trust automation and when to override it. It's the person who can understand what victory is supposed to achieve beyond simply winning the engagement. Technology handles the flying. Humans handle the meaning. And you believe that's a skill set that can be trained?" "I believe it's a skill set that must be trained, sir, because the alternative is building weapons systems that optimize for outcomes we haven't fully defined. AI will execute missions with perfect efficiency. Only humans can decide whether those missions should be executed at all." Silence in the room. Then the general nodded slowly. "Thank you, Ms. Riordan. That's the most honest assessment I've heard in 30 years of acquisition briefings." The program received full operational funding 3 weeks later. Valdez Aerospace was contracted to build 12 Wraith platforms for testing with operational squadrons. Training protocols would be developed based on Kale's experience, and she was offered a position as chief instructor pilot, responsible for teaching the next generation how to fly with AI instead of against it. She accepted, with one condition: that every pilot who went through training understood that working with advanced AI wasn't about giving up control. It was about sharing it with an intelligence that approached problems differently, but toward the same ultimate goal: bringing everyone home. The call came on a Thursday evening, 6 months after the Pentagon presentation, while Kale was reviewing training curriculum at her desk in Test Site 7. Marcus Valdez's secretary, asking if she'd heard the news, could she please turn on CNN? She pulled up the channel on her computer, and there was her face. Not recent footage, the viral video from the Gulf Stream rescue, over a year old now, but edited with new context. The anchor was explaining how the pilot who'd saved 18 lives over Iceland was now leading development of next-generation fighter technology. They were calling it the Widow Program, after her call sign, treating it as a story of individual heroism rather than collaborative development. The narrative bothered her immediately. It centered her instead of the work, personality over process. The comments were worse, half praised her, half questioned whether a woman could really be lead pilot on advanced fighters, as if gender determined capability more than the 4,000 hours proving otherwise. She called Valdez. "This needs to be corrected. I'm not leading this program alone, and making it about me undermines the actual finding, that this is collaborative work between human and artificial intelligence. I know, I've already contacted their producers, but Kale, you need to understand something. That video from Iceland has been viewed 40 million times now. People connect with individual stories, not systemic findings. You've become a symbol whether you want to be or not. The question is how we use that." "I don't want to be used. I want to do the work." "They're not mutually exclusive." His voice carried an edge she rarely heard. "Right now, there's a debate happening about whether AI should replace pilots. That debate is being dominated by people who have never flown, never made tactical decisions where seconds determine life or death. Your voice matters. Not because you're extraordinary, but because you're excellent at something that requires both human judgment and willingness to trust technology. People need to hear that." Kale stared at her screen, watching footage of herself climbing out of an F-16 at some airshow 3 years prior, wondering how she'd become a symbol for debates she'd never intended to join. "What do you need from me?" "Give one interview. Explain what the Widow Program actually means. Not you specifically, but what you represent pilots who can collaborate with AI instead of competing against it. Frame the narrative before someone else does it wrong." She agreed, reluctantly, and 3 days later found herself in a studio in Las Vegas, facing a correspondent from 60 Minutes who'd done more homework than Kale expected. The interview lasted 90 minutes. They used 12 minutes in the broadcast. But those 12 minutes mattered. She explained that the Widow Program wasn't about creating better dogfighters. It was about creating better decision-makers who happen to fly. She talked about Arya as a partner, not a tool. She described the future of military aviation as collaborative rather than competitive, human judgment amplified by machine precision rather than replaced by it. The public response was mixed. Half saw validation that human pilots remained essential. Half questioned why, if AI could fly better, they should risk human lives at all. The debate that followed was exactly what Kale had wanted to avoid: polarized, simplified, missing nuance in favor of sound bites. But among pilots, the response was different. Messages flooded her inbox from active duty aviators, test pilots, instructors, all asking the same thing. "How do we learn to do what you've done? How do we work with AI that's smarter than us in ways that matter? How do we remain essential when technology keeps advancing?" Kale answered every message personally, often spending hours explaining that relevance wasn't about being better than machines. It was about being different in ways that mattered. And slowly, a community formed. Pilots who understood the future wasn't about choosing sides in some human versus machine competition, but about building partnerships that made both more capable. 12 pilots reported for the first Widow Program training cycle on a February morning that felt more like ceremony than instruction. They came from different services: Air Force, Navy, Marines, with different backgrounds and specialties, but one thing in common: they'd all volunteered to learn something that didn't fit traditional aviation training. Kale stood in front of them in the same hangar where she'd first seen Wraith, looking at faces that reflected the same mixture of excitement and uncertainty she'd felt 18 months earlier. You're here to learn how to fly with advanced AI. Not for it, not against it, but with it. That requires unlearning some things you've been taught. It requires accepting that being the best pilot doesn't mean making every decision yourself. It means knowing which decisions are yours to make, and which are better handled by systems that process information faster and more completely than human perception allows. She spent 3 months teaching them what she'd learned, watching as competent pilots struggled with the hardest part, trusting automation enough to let go without surrendering judgment. Some adapted quickly, finding the partnership natural. Others fought it, treating Arya as subordinate rather than collaborator, and their performance suffered accordingly. The best student was a young Marine captain named Tor's, no relation to Rebecca Tor's, the engineer, who approached AI collaboration with the same tactical pragmatism she brought to every other aspect of flying. She didn't compete with Arya. She used it, pushing the AI to explain recommendations, challenging calculations, building understanding through interrogation rather than blind trust. Why did Arya suggest this approach vector instead of the one I chose? Tors asked during a debriefing. Because Arya calculated threat density and projected engagement timelines that showed your approach would result in 3.2 additional seconds of exposure to SAM coverage. But my approach allows immediate egress if the target is defended differently than intelligence suggests. Arya's approach commits us to a narrow corridor with limited escape options. Correct. The question is whether you value speed of execution or flexibility of response. Tor studied the data, then nodded. In this scenario, with intelligence this reliable, Arya is right. But if intelligence confidence was lower, I'd override and accept the exposure risk to maintain options. That was it. That was the judgment that made human pilots essential, understanding when to trust systems and when to weight factors that couldn't be perfectly quantified. Tors got it instinctively, and by the end of training, her integration scores with Arya exceeded even Kale's. On graduation day, Kale addressed the 12 pilots who completed the program. You're the first. You'll deploy to operational squadrons, introduce this capability, teach others what you've learned. You'll face resistance from pilots who see AI as threat, skepticism from commanders who don't understand why we need humans in the loop. Your job is to prove through performance that human-AI collaboration works better than either alone. Not by arguing, but by bringing everyone home better than anyone thought possible. The pilots dispersed to their units, carrying capability that would gradually transform how the military thought about aviation. Reports came back over the following months: Wraith platforms integrated into carrier operations, successful combat simulations, incidents where human judgment overrode AI recommendations and saved missions. The technology was working. More importantly, the partnership was working. Kale remained at Test Site 7, overseeing subsequent training cycles, refining doctrine, answering questions from pilots worldwide who were learning to fly with AI. The work was satisfying in ways that pure flying had never been. Teaching felt like multiplication. Each pilot she trained would teach others, creating geometric expansion of capability. She was reviewing student performance data on a September afternoon when Marcus Valdez appeared at her office door. "Do you have a minute?" "Of course." She gestured to the chair across from her desk, noticed he looked tired in ways that suggested more than physical exhaustion. "I wanted to tell you before it goes public. I'm stepping down as CEO. My board thinks I'm too focused on experimental programs, not enough on quarterly returns. They're probably right," he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I built this company to push boundaries. They want to consolidate what we've already achieved." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I'm 60 now. Maybe it's time to let someone else worry about profit margins." He paused. "But I wanted to ask you something. The Widow program has become bigger than Valdez Aerospace. Multiple defense contractors are building AI collaborative platforms now. The military is revising pilot training doctrine. There's talk of establishing a dedicated school for human AI collaboration. They want you to run it. Kale set down the tablet she'd been holding. That's not a test pilot position. That's administrative. That's leadership. Building the institution that ensures what you've proven becomes standard practice rather than experimental capability. He leaned forward. You saved my life. Then you proved that human pilots have a future in aviation that's increasingly automated. Now you have a chance to make that future real for every pilot who comes after you. That's not administration. That's legacy. She thought about the students she'd trained, the pilots she'd mentored, the messages she received weekly from aviators trying to navigate the same questions she'd faced 18 months earlier. Teaching one class at a time was impact. Building the school that taught thousands was transformation. Yes, she said, I'll do it. The Air Force Aviation Integration School opened 2 years later at Nellis Air Force Base, purpose-built facility designed to train pilots in human-AI collaboration across all platforms. Kale served as commandant, overseeing curriculum development, instructor training, and integration with operational squadrons. The work was harder than test flying, more complex than combat, but it mattered in ways that extended beyond any single mission. She built the school on principles learned from flying with Aria. That collaboration required trust, that trust required understanding, that understanding required pilots willing to accept they were partners with technology rather than masters of it. The curriculum emphasized judgment over execution, strategic thinking over tactical perfection, moral reasoning over mechanical proficiency. Critics said she was making pilots soft, undermining warrior ethos with philosophy. She responded by pointing to performance data. Graduates of the integration school had lower mishap rates, higher mission success rates, and better adaptability to rapidly changing tactical environments than pilots trained traditionally. The proof was in outcomes, and outcomes didn't lie. 5 years after the Gulf Stream rescue that had changed her life, Kale stood on the flight line at Nellis, watching a formation of 6 Wraith platforms launch for a training mission. The aircraft were operational now, deployed with frontline squadrons, flown by pilots who'd learned that working with AI made them more effective than fighting alone ever could. One of those pilots was Tors, now a major, leading the formation. She'd become the most effective Wraith pilot in the operational force, her integration scores with Aria consistently exceeding projections. More importantly, she'd become an advocate, teaching other pilots through example that the future didn't require them to become less human. It required them to become more thoughtfully human, more deliberately human, more essential. The jets climbed into clear desert sky, their engine sound fading to silence that felt more like peace than absence. Kale watched until they were specks against blue, thinking about the path from that morning over Iceland to this moment, from emergency intercept to institutional transformation, from individual capability to systemic change. Her career had started with the simple goal of being excellent at flying fighters. It had evolved into something more complex and more important, proving that excellence wasn't about fighting technology, but about partnering with it. That human judgment remained essential not because humans were superior, but because they were different in ways that mattered. She'd become visible despite wanting to disappear, symbolic despite preferring to be practical. But visibility had purpose when it served something larger than ego. She'd used her platform to change how the military thought about pilots, how pilots thought about AI, how humans thought about their relationship with increasingly capable machines. The work would continue long after she left it. Other pilots would refine what she'd started. Next-generation AI would challenge assumptions she'd helped establish. Technology would advance beyond what anyone currently imagined. That was inevitable, necessary, right. What mattered was that the foundation was set. Human pilots had a future in automated aviation, not because they could outfly computers, but because they could outthink them in the ways that defined what flight was supposed to achieve. Victory wasn't about speed or precision or technical capability. It was about understanding what winning was supposed to mean, what missions were worth flying, what risks were acceptable in service of values that couldn't be perfectly quantified. Kale walked back to her office, past photographs of generations of pilots who'd flown before AI, who defined aviation through pure human skill and courage. Their legacy was real, important, worthy of honor, but it wasn't complete. Her generation's contribution was proving that the story didn't end with automation. It transformed, evolved, continued in forms that required pilots to be something more than just good at flying. She sat at her desk, reviewed reports from integration school graduates deployed worldwide, and felt satisfaction that came not from personal achievement, but from knowing the work would outlast her. Somewhere, a pilot was learning to trust AI. Somewhere, an AI was learning from human judgment. Somewhere, the partnership she'd helped prove was saving lives, completing missions, advancing capability in ways that made everyone more secure. That was legacy. Not individual heroism, but systemic improvement. Not being remembered, but building something that ensured others could succeed. The Widow program wasn't about her. It never had been. It was about proving that collaboration trumped competition, that partnership exceeded capability, that the future belonged to those willing to work with intelligence different than their own. Evening came to Nellie's, sunset painting the flight line in shades of copper and amber. Somewhere above the base, those 6 Wraith platforms would be executing maneuvers that combined human tactical judgment with machine precision, proving again that what she'd started 5 years ago was right. Cale Riordan, call sign Widow, former test pilot and current commandant of the Air Force Aviation Integration School, watched the sky darken and felt at peace. She'd found her purpose not in the cockpit, but in teaching others to fly better than she ever had. Not by being extraordinary, but by being excellent at something that mattered enough to change how an entire profession thought about its future. The phone rang: student emergency, instructor question, operational issue requiring her attention. She answered, got back to work, continued the mission that had started with a single rescue over the North Atlantic, and evolved into a career that had transformed military aviation. The sky darkened, the work continued, and somewhere in the silence between missions, Cale knew she'd done what pilots are supposed to do. She'd brought everyone home better than when she found them. That was enough. It would always be enough.